Continue our conversation now as we mark 7 years since that event that really brought South Africa to a standstill. The lives of mine workers haven't changed that much since the massacre 7 years ago, and that's even those striking Lonmin mine workers at that time did eventually get the salary increase they had fought for. And it was a struggle that ended with the deaths of 34 people on this day in 2012. 10 more people had lost their lives in the days leading up to that event on that day as well. To talk some more around that event and if the mining industry has taken heed of the events of that day, I'm joined now via Skype by political economist Lebogang Pheko. Lebogang, thank you so much for joining me right now. It's really been a day of being able to look back at the facts of the day, whether we've seen any follow-up on the report that was done after the Commission of Inquiry, whether the industry has taken heed of those lessons and whether the country has as well. What's your view this day 7 years on?
So the mining sector has been going through a lot of, it's been going through a transformation over the last, even before Marikana, and that's where some of the tensions have emerged from, mainly because the levels and the forms of extraction need to change in keeping with the times, and that hasn't really happened. And this means then that you still have a situation where several, the personnel who go down to mine the minerals are going in very difficult conditions. The hours are not regulated as well as they could be. And also we still have some of the deepest mines in this country globally. And another factor of that is that the general infrastructural development around mining cities and mining towns is historically supposed to then lead to stronger, stronger nodes. So, for example, you look at a province like Gauteng, for example, which basically started as a mining town and, of course, has developed into something that's very cosmopolitan and vibrant. And I'm not suggesting that that is the only and the best model for mining development, but there is nothing in Marikana to suggest that there's even an attempt to have, good roads, schools, reasonable housing. The housing there can only be described as almost slum-like, despite the lives that were lost. And I think that when we then mediate this against the arguments that a lot of the corporations have been making that profits are low, which is quite untrue, there's a huge difference, of course, between the levels of expectations that emerged from the Farnham report and the Commission and what has actually been delivered, which is very, very little. Added to that, of course, is that many of the widows still have also not received many of their benefits.
Now, speaking of profits, the profits in the platinum industry were at a record high at the time that Marikana happened. And if that wasn't a time for mining owners and mining bosses to put all of that money where their mouths are, what are the chances of them doing so now?
When the economy has actually taken a downturn, and when in fact there's an argument that says that there has to be disinvestment in this sector, even though it's true that these resources are finite, and that we need to think about transitional economics and transitional means of livelihood, transitional skilling, that cannot be at the expense of, in the interim, ensuring that the people who are able, that people and families, communities are not depleted further by the mining sector, the environmental risks and the trauma, and I think that as well, oftentimes the areas around mines are some of the least developed, and there's been no attempt in recent years to obviate and ameliorate that situation where the water isn't contaminated and so on. So what really should be a public good in terms of increased jobs, increased skilling, schools in the area, clinics in the area, sanitation, then becomes a social hazard, leading to the sorts of conditions that will foment the anger that we saw at Marikana, bearing in mind, of course, that it was the police who opened fire upon the miners, contrary to some of the really disgusting propaganda that's still doing the rounds, that these men were drugged, that they had taken muti, that they were on the rampage, and this really disgusting narrative of black attack, which is completely false.
I've been going back to the work at the time of the Marikana massacre, the work and research that was being published by people like David van Wyk, the researcher from Benchmarks Foundation. And I remember at the time, during an interview with him, he pointed to the mines that were owned by Impala Platinum and Aquarius Platinum in a country like Zimbabwe, a neighboring country. And there, the housing was provided, there was 100% literacy, and so on in terms of regulation. And the finger at the time was being pointed at the fact that those companies had activities in South Africa at the time, but they weren't giving the same benefits and living conditions and all of those things to miners doing the same work, if not more so, in South Africa. And the finger was being pointed at the fact that government at the time was so closely linked to those various boards of those very powerful mining companies. Do you think that there's still too much of a blurring of the lines there, and that is why we haven't seen enough regulation from government side?
It could be a blurring of the lines. It could be also just policy uncertainty. It could be, of course, the delays in the amendments in the various mineral resources development acts. It could be the legal wrangling over the latest mining charter, which in itself is extremely problematic. Now, even though mines employ some of the highest paid industrial workers in the countryside alongside Eskom, as Eskom employees, this does not by any means that their wages are the best that they could be, comparable to the worth of the job and the value of the job and the value of the rand that they collect in the soil versus what they're actually paid. I think it also speaks to in 2018, for example, minerals accounted for 38% of all exports. That's a huge amount of GDP contribution. Bearing in mind that in this country, I think globally, our mining sector is the fifth largest contributor to the mining sector, which is massive. So it's despite all of the talk by the industry, particularly the captains of industry, of pleading poverty and pleading inability to really provide better living conditions and better healthcare conditions and so on. It's really just false, particularly given the huge pay gaps between themselves, the captains of industry and the miners who actually mine this. And of course, when you think about the sorts of royalties as well that are created on mineral rights, so the direct taxes, payroll taxes, and of course royalties for mining, which are massive. And these taxes are supposed to pay for the education, the healthcare, and the social development, not only of the mining workers, but of millions of South Africans. So if we're not actually gaining these in full and claiming these as a state from companies such as Lonmin and others, it means that then there's a huge deficit in expected income into our economy. And it also means that really we're being quite spineless in enabling countries, enabling companies which would not behave in this manner in other countries to do so here in South Africa.
We're going to leave it there. Thank you so much. A political economist, Lebogang Pheko, always a straight shooter. Thank you so much for your time.